What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. Curtis Anderson and myself would like to revisit some of the fighters that was already listed into 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all times. The criteria that was carefully listed on why fighters need to be on this list. The eras in which they came, fighters that they fought, the time that they came in, what they can get away with, what they could not get away with. For instance, Dave Holly, born March 2nd, 1881, Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was 133 to 140 pounds. Fought fighters such as Joe Gans, Jack Blackburn, Sam Bolden, Belfield Langford, Joe Walcott, Sam Langford, Dixie Kidd, George Cole, Ruff Turner, George Gunther, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost. That's just an example of some of the fighters that he fought. Dave Holly cannot be compared in many eras to what he had to go through, what he's seen, what was dictated to him. And he fought all the fighters in his era, never given an opportunity for a title shot. We look at Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, born 1886, Melville, New Jersey. He stood 5 foot 10 inches, short for his division, weighed 165 to 193 pounds. He was in the ring with Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Kid Norford, Dixie Kidd, Peter Moha, battling Levinsky, Harry Wells, Sam Langford. Just think about that for one moment. Charlie Burley, born September 6, 1917, stood 5 foot 9 inches, weighed 145 to 162 pounds. He was the California light heavyweight champion when he defeated Jack Chase. He was the colored welterweight champion when he defeated Coco Kid. He became the colored middleweight champion when he defeated Holman Williams. He was in the ring with Aaron Tiger Wade and Burt Lytell, Holman Williams 7 times, Jimmy Bivens, Oakland Billy Smith, Lloyd Marshall, Dave Clark, Joe Carter, Charlie Banks, Archie Moore, Coco Kid, and Ezard Charles. Lloyd Marshall, born June 4th, 1914, Madison Square Garden, was a home for Lloyd Marshall. He stood 5 foot 10 inches. He had an amateur career of 212 fights with 17 losses. As a professional, he would have 64 wins, 24 losses, and 32 knockouts. But let's take a look at the fighters that he fought. Ken Overland, Seferino Garcia, Lou Brillard, Teddy Uras, Carl Bobo Olsen. These are fighters who are all champions. Eddie Babe Risco, Eddie Booker, Freddie Mills, Charlie Burley, Jack Chase, Holman Williams, Ezard Charles, Archie Moore, Joey Maxim. Just an example of some of the men he was in with. Can't compare that. When you look at Joe Jeanette, he was born August 26, 1879. He stood 5 foot 10 inches, had well over 100 street fights. He weighed between 185 to 205 pounds. He was in the ring with fighters such as Big Bill Tate and George Cole, Jack Johnson, who he was in the ring with him 10 times, Black Bill, and George Carpentier, Sam Langford, Arthur Perkley, Black Fitzsimmons, who they called Kid Monday, Harry Wells, and battling Jim Johnson, as well as Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost. These fighters were amazing, very underrated, never had a title shot. They were the greatest fighters of all times, outside of Jack Johnson, who did get a title shot. Now, when you take a look at Sam Langford, who was born March 4th, 1886, Nova Scotia, he stood 5 foot 6.5 to 7 inches, weighed 139 to 204 pounds. And he was in the ring with Larry Temple, Jeff Clark, Young Peter Jackson, and Dixie Kidd, Peter Lang. You had a man by the name of Jack Blackburn, Joe Gans, and Harry Wells, George Godfrey, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Kid Norford, Sam McVeigh and Tiger Flowers, John Lester Johnson and Big Bill Tate and Stanley Ketchel, Fireman Jim Flynn, Ed Bearcat Wright. He was in a ring with Joe Jeanette and Jack Johnson, Klondike Haynes, and John Sandy Ferguson. I want you to think about that for one moment. What did Sam Langford go through? What kind of fighters did he fight? Look at the era in which he came. Could he dictate anything? Can he talk back? Could he refuse fights? You know, his last fight, he didn't answer the bell for the first round because he realized he couldn't see the man in front of him. And he had to be escorted back out of the ring. Sam McVeigh, May 17th, 1884, was from Texas. Stood 5 foot 10 inches. And he fought Sam Langford, Bill Lang and Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, Jim Barry and Jeff Clark, Jack Johnson and Denver Ed Martin, Harry Wills, as well as Joe Jeanette. I just want you to think about that for one moment as we go through the eras of some of the greatest black fighters. Fights that they didn't get. It wasn't allowed to fight. The mafia had dictated a lot of the terms. They were robbed. By the time they visited a location, it wasn't the fighter who they were supposed to fight. A lot of these men couldn't have a corner man. They couldn't even get their own water. Sam McVeigh was in very, very obscene situations and or circumstances. It's important that we understand that because when we try to compare fighters, we leave a lot of those details out. And I want everybody to understand why these videos are created. Look at Bobby Dobbs. He stood 5 foot 8 inches, weighed 125 to 136 pounds. He was in a ring with Joe Gans and Joe Cole. He was also in a ring with Charlie Martin and George Kid Lavin, Frank Childs, Black Frank Taylor, and Charles Hadley. We look at Burt Littell. They called him Chocolate Kid. He stood 5 foot 9 inches. He was a middleweight. He was in a ring with Harold Johnson and Charlie Doc Williams, Roy Williams and Oakland Billy Smith, Major Jones. He was in a ring with Coco Kid and Charlie Burley and Holman Willie. Really good fighter was Burt Littell. Harry Smith, the Harlem Thunderbolt, was born October 28, 1907, Kingston, Jamaica. Had 155 fights. Most of those fights are not even recorded. He was a colored middleweight champion, 1929, when he defeated Jack McVeigh. He was also a Metropolitan welterweight champion as an amateur. He was also in the ring with Jimmy Francis and Holman Robinson. Pal Silver. Tell you who Pal Silver was. Joe Louis was entering the ring to fight a young man by the name of Jimmy Braddock. And Pal Silvers was watching Joe Louis. And he was elected to be a sparring partner for Joe Louis. And once Joe Louis had knocked out Jimmy Braddock in the 8th round at Kaminsky Park, he was selected to become that sparring partner in preparation for Tommy Farr. But Joe Louis had hit him with a left hook. And Pal Silvers went through the ropes and out the ring in sparring. Claims he got injured. And when Joe Louis was walking into the ring to face Max Melling in 1938 for his second fight, don't you know Joe Louis was hit with a fine of $50,000 by Pal Silvers? Quite a story, I'll tell you. And Jack McVeigh, the pride of Harlem, he stood 5 foot 9 inches. He was in the ring with Joe Dundee and Pete Latzo, Maxie Rosenblum and Harry Smith, Ace Hudkins, and K.O. Kelly. Look at the names that he fought. Kid Norfolk was born September 20th, 1895. He stood 5 foot 8 inches. He weighed 165 to 185 pounds. He was in the ring with Billy Misk. I'll tell you about him in one moment. Harry Greb and Jeff Clark. He was in the ring with Tiger Flowers and Lee Anderson, Big Bill Tate and Tom Caller. Black Big Burns. He was also in the ring with Jamaica Kid, John Lester Johnson, Battling Siki, Blackfoot Simmons, Harry Greb, Joe Jeanette, and Jeff Clark. Getting back to Billy Misk. Billy Misk was diagnosed with Bright disease. And it turned out he had one wish, only one wish, before he died. He wanted to have a Christmas for his family. So he took on Bill Brennan. He defeated Bill Brennan. And it was a very touching story when I read that, because Billy Misk fought Jack Dempsey and fought many fighters. Jeff Smith. But these are the kind of fighters who had multiple fights with each other. We look at Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. He was defeated on March 18th, 1893 against Joe Butler. Joe Butler was a colored middleweight champion, fought in Philadelphia. And after losing to Dan Cretan, October 14th, 1895 for the middleweight championship belt of England, Frank Craig defeated George Crisp. November 24th, 1898 in the 13th round. We look at Holman Williams. He was in the ring with Coco Kid 14 times. He lost 9 times. Charlie Burley, 7 times. He won 3, lost 3, and had 1 no contest. You see, this is what we're talking about when we look at great fighters. And in this case, black fighters that need to be on a list of 150 greatest black fighters of all times. I hope you understand a little better of where we're going. One more fighter, young Peter Jackson. He won a California State Lightweight Championship January 12th, 1932. From Young Manuel, he won a vacant Pacific Coast Lightweight Championship belt over Ang Wang Lee, July 25th, 1933. Then he would win the Mexican Lightweight Championship belt, March 31st, 1935, once again from Young Manuel. And he fought for the Colored Welterweight Championship belt, July 26, 1936, against Coco Kid. The fight took place in Hank Park in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was for the Colored Welterweight Championship belt. 2 rounds, scheduled for 10. August 22nd, 1938, he lost the Colored Welterweight Championship belt to Charlie Burley, Hickory Park, and Melville, Pennsylvania. Charlie Burley would drop Coco Kid 3 times, defeating him 15 rounds. These are fighters that need to be on this list. Let me tell you about a fighter. Let me really tell you about a fighter. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Tommy Hurricane Jackson. He fought Floyd Patterson twice. That's not all with Tommy Hurricane Jackson. He was born August 9th, 1931 in Sparta, Georgia. He died February 14th, 1982. He was 50 years of age at the time of his death. He had a total bout career of 45 fights, 35 wins, 16 knockouts, 9 losses, and 1 draw. Now, he stood 6 foot 2 inches and had a 76-inch reach. He fought about 318 rounds, if I remember correctly, in his professional career. He was managed and trained by Whitey Bimstein and Freddie Brown. Now, Carter fought from 1951 to 1961. He had a 10-year stretch. He fought fighters, former and past their peak, such as Edward Charles. Fought him August 3rd, 1955, then again August 31st, 1955. Jackson began fighting as the number 1 ranked contender in the heavyweight division for Rocky Marciano's spot when he retired in 56. But instead, Rocky Marciano would choose to face the old mongoose, Archie Moore, who became the light heavyweight champion by defeating Joey Maxim in 1952. And Floyd Patterson was a gold medal winner that same year, 1952, in the Helsinki Games. He won in the middleweight division. Patterson was ranked number 1 as a light heavyweight in his first year as a professional. And he would fight a man who had his first professional fight and give him a title shot. I'll allow you to look him up. But Bob Baker didn't get that opportunity. He was ranked number 2. And that's just the way things went in boxing. Jackson wound up with a career of 40 fights. 55 wins, 8 losses, 40 knockouts. He was stopped 5 times and he had 1 draw. For Roy Harrison, Archie Moore, Brian London, and Charlie Powell. was in the ring with Alvin Blue Lewis. Tommy Hurricane Jackson, very underrated fighter. And it's just unfortunate that things happen the way they happen. And that's the reason why this series is being looked at. Because there's a lot of fighters that's not being mentioned as great fighters. They had their opportunities to some extent, but they came up in eras where the ball was against them. And that's why I say you can't compare today's fighters to yesterday's fighters. When you look at today's fighters, it's hard to get a man in the ring once in 1 year. You have some fighters who fought 3 guys or 5 guys so far, and they're worthy fighters, but they're not mega fights. They're not what you call super bouts. And some of the men that I read off to you had those same fights within 6 months with all the big names that you have today. And that's why we have to put it all in perspective. Now, yeah, a lot of fighters will be mentioned in this era in the 50 category of the 150 greatest black fighters. But they can't be compared to the fighters that's ranked in the 100 portion of 150 great fighters. Scrapbook Boxing, Kurt Anderson, 100 years of world championship fights.